From the newsrooms of the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, this is Please Explain. I'm Samantha Selinger-Morris. It's Wednesday, August 23rd. How can Australia avoid being dragged into a war with China? Is building up our own military the best way to manage what is, diplomatically speaking, a relationship with a frenemy? And not just any frenemy, but one armed with nuclear weapons? This is Australia's current tactic, cemented on Monday when the Albanese government announced that it was going ahead with its plan to buy cruise missiles from the United States. Even though Beijing has previously claimed that our acquisition of these missiles would be triggering a regional arms race. Today, international and political editor Peter Hartcher on what Kevin Rudd, now the Australian ambassador to the United States, has said about how we should navigate what he's called the decade of living dangerously. So, Peter, you've just reported on a speech, unreported on until now, that Kevin Rudd gave in Singapore last week. And in that speech, Rudd, the former Australian Prime Minister and now the Australian ambassador to the United States, he uttered what sounded like a stark warning about the possibility of a war between China and the United States and what this could mean for us. So what did he say?
Well, it was a pretty bracing speech. Rudd, since he's been ambassador, Rudd has been much more cautious about what he says and doesn't speak half as much as he used to, of course, when he was Prime Minister. But he's since become very guarded, very cautious. So to give a speech like this in public was actually pretty bold. But I'll quote him briefly. He was talking about the concept of strategic balance as being essential to preserving peace in the Indo-Pacific. So defining what does strategic equilibrium mean, he said, Ukraine provides a tell-example of what happens when equilibrium and deterrence fail. If equilibrium and balance were to fail in our region and we ended up in a general war, the consequences for the world at large would be catastrophic. Of course, he's talking there about potential war between China and the US. And then Rudd again, history tells us that when it comes to the great powers, the idea of a limited war is generally fanciful. So in other words, he's warning of a potential unlimited war between two nuclear-armed great powers.
And so, can you sort of walk us through that? What does that mean, an unlimited war?
It means that both powers use everything at their disposal to try to subdue the other, which implies conventional but also nuclear war. Under Xi Jinping in the last few years, they've had a remarkably rapid rollout of new and more nuclear weapons. The evidence is they're trying to mimic the US strategic triad, where you have nuclear weapons in the air, in the sea, on submarines, and also on land. And they're building it so quickly that it's raised a lot of concern in a lot of countries. But an unlimited war would presumably, or could presumably, involve nuclear weapons and destruction of large numbers of people.
So you mentioned there that Kevin Rudd spoke of consequences for the world at large being possibly catastrophic. And this sounds like something of an escalation on Kevin Rudd's part. In March this year, he said it was Australia's role as a friend and an ally of the US to help build guardrails into the relationship to avert a dangerous deterioration, so we don't sort of end up in a war by accident. And now he's talking about the consequences of a possible war being catastrophic. So what's happened between March and now?
I think it's fair to say that Kevin is alarmed by a couple of things, but primarily there was a notable change of rhetoric from Xi Jinping that began, I think May 30th was the first time he used the expression extreme scenarios. And quite a number of sinologists have pointed out that this is an escalation of the rhetoric of risk from Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping for years has gone around from military base to military base in China. He puts on military fatigues usually, addresses the troops, and he says, prepare to fight and win wars. Xi Jinping has been saying this to his people and his military, and it's in the state-owned media, party-owned media, every month, year in, year out. But now he's escalated and said, prepare for extreme circumstances and extreme situations. And that has tipped a lot of people, including, I think it's fair to say, Kevin Rudd, into worrying that there may be more imminent action from Beijing than we'd heretofore expected.
Okay, so that brings us to what happened on Monday when the Albanese government announced that it would proceed with buying hundreds of cruise missiles from the United States. And in March, when the United States Congress approved this sale, Beijing responded by saying this was, quote, triggering a regional arms race, unquote. So what weapons are we getting? How are they different from what we previously had? And has there been any news from Beijing since our government announced that it was buying these missiles?
So for decades now, Australia hasn't had any long-range strike weapons. That's been based on the threat assessment that we won't need them. But behind the scenes, if a Chinese base emerges on the Solomon Islands, what does Australia do about it? And there are signs of hostilities. What if the Chinese Communist Party attacks Taiwan, Philippines, and Australia decides to get involved? What capability do we have to do anything about it? The answer at the moment is nothing. Nothing. So this government is now acquiring Tomahawks and other various missiles.
Major boost for Australia's military arsenal with multi-billion-dollar purchase of world-leading Navy missiles.
Australia will spend $1.7 billion buying Tomahawk cruise missiles to boost our long-range defence.
The Tomahawk missiles, it's been publicised that they have a range of 1,500 kilometres. Depending on the variant that you buy, they have a range of up to 2,500.
We are only the third nation in the world to acquire Tomahawk cruise missiles that have a range of around 1,500 kilometres.
They're cruise missiles. You would use them to attack a city, you'd use them to attack an enemy ship, that sort of thing. They're subsonic.
This is a significant leap forward for the Royal Australian Navy in terms of our deterrence.
And also they've said they're committing $1 billion plus to build a factory in Australia where Australia can manufacture its own missiles, because 200 Tomahawks in a real war would last maybe 24 hours. So what they've announced is really just a very, it's more a token of intent than an actual capability. There hasn't been any fresh complaint from Beijing. This is Australia confirming something that it's announced a couple of times in prospect and now it's in reality. So we haven't had any fresh complaints, but we can probably expect some.
Right, okay, which I guess brings us to the crux of your latest column. The headline was, can Australia prevent war by getting ready to fight one? So, Peter, can it?
Well, the precedent, I suppose, for a great power standoff was the Cold War between the USSR and the US. And there we saw the peace, at least there was no hot war. There were proxy wars, nasty things happened, but there was no state-on-state warfare between the two superpowers because no side could see itself winning easily, cleanly, at an acceptable cost. And so the concept of deterrence, or in the nuclear case, mutually assured destruction, held out pretty well for half a century. It's not a guarantee, and you always have to think what's the other guy got in his mind or her mind about hostilities and is it a good idea or not, and try to anticipate the calculus of your enemy. But, well, let me quote Anthony Albanese from the Labor conference on the weekend in Brisbane, where he said, there is no security in isolation. So Australia isolates itself and hopes and prays that it gets left aside. But we've already seen China's intent towards Australia. We've seen it in the trade sanctions. We've seen it in other actions. The intent is to break Australian sovereign will insofar as it can do it at a low cost. So Albanese, both the major political parties have taken the bet that trying to sit out a confrontation would not be in our interests, and in fact we'd find ourselves isolated with our trade lines of communication to the world dominated by an unfriendly power. If Chinese friends were to dominate the region, then we were defenseless.
Okay, so you mentioned there something pivotal to this, which is that China's got these trade bans that they've put on us. And I guess that gets us to this sort of key idea, which is that the relationship between Australia and China is, as they say, complicated. So we're building up our military arsenal to try and ward off a war with China. But at the same time, China is the biggest trade partner we have. We're fighting these trade bans. So this sounds diplomatically like the ultimate frenemy type situation, for lack of a better term. So how can Albanese possibly manage these seemingly incompatible goals?
Well, you're right, it is a frenemy situation. And many countries have this dilemma. Until recently, China was also America's biggest trading partner. Most countries in the world, I think it's about 140 countries in the world, list China as their main trading partner.
Wow.
So many, many countries, including the ones in confrontations now with China, still count China as their main trading partner.
Right.
How do you manage it? Well, the formula Penny Wong articulated, she said, Australia uses reassurance and deterrence. Reassurance, on the one hand, is some of the things you talked about. So trying to get China to drop the punitive trade bans on Australian products, restoring political dialogue meetings, Albanese supposedly going to Beijing in a few months. So that's reassurance, to try to reassure China that Australia is well-intentioned and happy to work with China insofar as it can. And the deterrence is the military build-up, it's the AUKUS submarines, it's tighter defence relationships with a bunch of countries. So they're the two parts. That's how you have a frenemy. You try and keep them happy on the one hand, or you have some hard power in the background. And there's an old quote that sums this up, which is, diplomacy is saying, nice doggy, while you reach around for a rock. So nice doggy, reassurance in Penny Wong's terms, looking for the rock, that's deterrence.
So where does that leave us in terms of, I guess now we just wait and see in terms of how these missiles that we've acquired, whether it tips that balance, whether it's too deterrent in China's mind? Is that sort of where we're at?
Well, I think where we're at is that even the strongest power realises that it cannot deter China alone. And that's implicit in the AUKUS agreement. It's implicit in other things that the US is doing. And in fact, Kurt Campbell, who is the Indo-Pacific coordinator in Joe Biden's White House, said to me a couple of years ago, he said, we cannot, meaning America, we cannot do it alone anymore. So what the US is trying to do is to encourage its allies, including Australia, but also including in Europe, Japan, South Korea, the Philippines and elsewhere, to join a collective deterrent is the term they use, and that the combined power of the US allied bloc is, they hope and pray, enough to deter Chinese military aggression. That's where we're at. And so Australia's part in that is only one part, but it's an important part. And we've seen since the announcement of AUKUS that other countries have been encouraged to be prepared to toughen up with China, to take more risks in confronting China. It's really a remarkable conversion or transformation that's underway in the world at the moment, where countries, goaded by China's behaviour but alarmed by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, are saying we really need to mobilise and to share the burden of collective deterrence.
And I guess just a follow-up question to what you've just mentioned there about America saying that it can't do it alone and that it needs partners to combat China. Is that a reflection of America's waning power on the global stage?
Yes, and its relative loss of power compared to China. So 50 years ago, China's economy was the same size as Australia's, for example. Now it's 10 times the size of Australia's. So China has grown apace, and the US has grown much more slowly. And the result is that the power relativities have shifted enormously. China now has a bigger navy, for example, than the US. That's a first. But it's more than that. It's more than just a one-on-one contest. So the guy who at the Pentagon led the creation of the US national security strategy in the last year of Trump, now he's not a mad Trumpite, he's actually a sensible national security guy, Elbridge Colby, said the logic for the US of needing to try to deter China from rewriting the world order is this, that the Asia-Pacific economy is the dominant part of the world economy. Any country that can dominate that can dominate the world. Therefore, the US had decided that it was in its own profound national interest to prevent that together with its allies. So that's pretty big picture thinking, but that's where this is coming from.
Well, we'll be looking forward to your next report on this, Peter.
Yeah, well, someone's got to do it.
Thank you, as always.
Pleasure, Samantha.
For joining us. Today's episode of Please Explain was produced by Julia Carr-Katzel, with technical assistance by Chi Wong. Our executive producer is Ruby Schwartz. Please Explain is a production of The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. If you enjoy the show and want more of our journalism, subscribe to our newspapers today. It's the best way to support what we do. Search The Age or smh.com.au/subscribe. I'm Samantha Selinger Morris. This is Please Explain. Thanks for listening.